I'd like to call this meeting of the Urbana City Council to order. Apologize for the delay. We had a special meeting upstairs which just ended. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Barnes?
Lynn?
I'm here by phone.
Good.
Mr. Bowersox?
Present.
Ms. Chenoweth? Mr. Lewis?
Present.
Mr. Roberts?
I'm here.
Mr. Smythe? Ms. Stevenson?
Present.
Mayor Pressing?
Here. Okay, the first item are 2 minutes from previous meetings, October 1st, a special meeting, and October 1st,
Oh, good.
the regular meeting. We're talking about the minutes, Lynn.
Okay, thank you.
Is there-
I now can hear. I cut out for about 2 or 3 minutes there.
Okay,
Thank you.
Welcome back.
all right. Is there a motion on the minutes?
So moved.
Okay, motion by Mr. Lewis, seconded by Mr. Smythe. Any additions or corrections to the minutes?
I'd just like to warn Lynn that this connection leaves a lot to be desired. Somehow it's changed from the last time you were on. I had a terrible time when I was with family. And so there are big sections where, Lynn, things are going to cut out, so just ask us to repeat.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I can't hear anything. It's like dead silent.
The microphone on the telephone is picking up everything in the background and cutting out. I don't know if that can be adjusted by the folks in the back or not. I've asked Bill DeJarnette to fix this system so that we have something that's more reliable.
Okay, let's have a vote on the minutes of October 1st, the special session, and the regular session. Sounds like we've lost
Yeah, that's a
Lynn.
disconnect thing, it looks like.
Okay, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, motion carries.
It's over here.
Are there any additions to the agenda? Okay, petitions and communications. I believe all the people that
Hello?
have... Lynn,
Are you hearing a little bit better now?
this is getting to be...
Yeah, I could not hear, but I don't know what was wrong.
Can you hear now?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Okay.
You.
Okay, does she want to talk at the time of the thing too? Okay. All right, I have cards of people who would like to address the city council, and I believe everyone wants to talk at the time the item is considered. Naomi Jacobson, did you want to talk at the beginning, or do you want to wait till the topic comes up? She'll wait, okay. All right, anyone else want to address the Urbana City Council? Okay, we will move forward. I don't believe we have any old business. Report of standing committees, the Committee of the Whole. Who chaired the last Committee of the Whole?
Danielle.
Danielle? It's Danielle.
That's correct. Ordinance number 2007-10-114, an ordinance approving an amendment to a redevelopment agreement with the new Lincoln Square LLC 2007. For the Committee of the Whole, I so move.
I second that.
I believe there's public input on this one.
Okay. Mike Lehman. I'm 608 East Green in Urbana. I'm here tonight representing the Urbana-Champaign Independent Media Center. I'm a member of the Board of Directors, President. I wanted to address some changes that I've been aware may be in the offing in the ordinance for the redevelopment of Lincoln Square. There's a parking lot that's located to the east of our building and to the west of the federal courthouse there, and directly to the south of the county courthouse across the building. It used to be the drive-through, and it's still the mail drop there. I believe it was originally leased or something. I'm not sure. The status has changed several times. My concern is that the status may change again under this redevelopment agreement. Typically, this is not a concern of ours until after 6 p.m. In the evenings, I do understand that this may be made into all Lincoln Square parking all the time. Yes, ma'am.
I believe that this agreement does not change parking
Okay.
at all.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to state our concerns here in
Okay.
case it did come up. One of the things is that I would prefer that it didn't change the status, and that's good to hear. If it does change, I would prefer to be metered or shared with the IMC or Lincoln Square. One of the things is if it was metered, this wouldn't be a great concern of ours. It would probably result in more income because of the traffic to the various areas. You got 2 courthouses. You have the IMC, although people don't typically park there during the day. But we would like to have access to that. We've invested approximately $500,000 at this point in downtown. We've asked for no assistance for redevelopment or anything else, and we're maintaining, for instance, the downtown service windows as part of this overall project, at least the way we've conceived it, and we've been there now over 2 years. So I would just ask that the parking there still remain flexible. I believe after 6 p.m. there's no basic issue with it, and that's basically the time when we would typically find patrons using our building, using that location.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Lehman?
It is my understanding.
Mr. Smythe.
It is my understanding it's a separate agreement.
It's a separate agreement from the Lincoln Square. Okay, so, you know, whatever it is, I did want to express my concern about that staying the way it was. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Chenoweth?
We don't have a vote on that yet.
Okay, here we have ordinance number 2007-10-114, the Lincoln Square redevelopment agreement. Would the clerk please call the roll? The clerk is not here. Where is the clerk?
We'll get one.
We need a roll call vote on ordinance, the first ordinance on the agenda.
Alderpersons Barnes,
Apparently not.
Bowersox,
Yes.
Chenoweth,
Yes.
Lewis, Roberts, Smythe, Stevenson.
Yes.
That motion carries. Ms. Chenoweth?
Okay.
Next, we have ordinance number 2007-10-112, an ordinance approving an amendment to the Urbana Home Consortium Community Housing Development Organization Agreement with the Urban League of Champaign County Development Corporation Lease Purchase Program fiscal years '06 and '07. For the Committee of the Whole, I so move.
Seconded by Mr. Lewis. Is there any discussion? Do we still have Lynn Barnes with us or not?
We're trying. I think we try to reconnect with her.
Okay.
It
All
doesn't
right.
look too good.
Would the clerk please call the roll?
Alderpersons Bowersox,
Yes.
Chenoweth,
Yes.
Lewis, Roberts,
Yes.
Smythe, Stevenson.
Yes.
That motion carries.
Next.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Next, we have ordinance number 2007-10-113, an ordinance approving an amendment to the Urbana Home Consortium Community Housing Development Organization Agreement. This is with Urban League of Champaign County Development Corporation Lease Purchase Program 07 and 08. For the Committee of the Whole, I so move.
Motion by Ms. Chenoweth, seconded by Mr. Smythe. Any discussion? If not, would the clerk please call the roll?
Alderpersons Bowersox,
Yes.
Chenoweth,
Yes.
Lewis, Roberts,
Yes.
Smythe, Stevenson.
That motion carries. Ms. Chenoweth?
Next, we have resolution number 2007-10-022R, a resolution determining the amounts of money necessary to be raised by the tax levy for 2007. For the Committee of the Whole, I so move.
I second that.
Okay, motion by Ms. Chenoweth, second by Mr. Roberts. Is there any discussion? If not, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
Nay.
Okay. One nay, the motion carries.
Next, we have resolution number 2007-10-023R, a resolution deeming certain funds in the Special Tax Allocation Fund for the Downtown Urbana Tax Increment Redevelopment Project Area as surplus funds and directing the payment and distribution thereof for 2007. For the Committee of the Whole, I so move.
I second that.
Motion by Ms. Chenoweth, second by Mr. Roberts. Is there any discussion? If not, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion carried.
Next,
Ms.
we have
Chenoweth.
ordinance number 2007-10-117, an ordinance revising the annual budget ordinance. This refers to the police range improvements via a state grant. For the Committee of the Whole, I so move. Second.
Okay, motion by Ms. Chenoweth, seconded by Ms. Stevenson. Any discussion? If not, would the clerk please call the roll?
Alderpersons Bowersox,
Yes.
Chenoweth,
Yes.
Lewis,
Yes.
Roberts,
Yes.
Smythe, Stevenson,
Yes.
Mayor Pressing.
Yes, that motion carries. Are there any reports of officers? Okay, we'll move on to new business. First is a motion authorizing the mayor to execute a real estate option and contract for property located at 302 West Springfield Avenue, Allman's Auto Repair.
So moved.
Motion by Mr. Smythe, seconded by Mr. Bowersox. Is there any discussion?
So that people understand this, it's a continuation basically of a real estate option that we've had while we look at environmental conditions of this property.
Okay, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion carries. Next, ordinance number 2007-10-119, an ordinance approving the designation of a local historic district, the 800 block of West Main Street, historic preservation case number HP 2007-D-01.
Hi, this
Robert
is...
Myers.
Thank you. This is an application by Daniel Falk to designate properties fronting on the 800 block of West Main Street as a local historic district. And the district, if enacted, would include residential properties between Lincoln and Busey Avenue. The Historic Preservation Commission, in following the Historic Preservation Ordinance, met twice and for two different considerations. The first consideration, they met on September 13th, and their task was to make a preliminary determination as to whether or not the application qualifies for designation as a local historic district based on the criteria in the ordinance. And at that meeting, they did determine, they made a preliminary determination that the district qualifies in that it had a significant number of buildings that, and I'll just paraphrase the criteria here, that have significant value as part of the architectural, artistic, civic, cultural, economic, educational, ethnic, political, or social heritage of the community, association with an important person or event in national, state, or local history, and representative of the distinguishing characteristics of an architectural style or type inherently valuable for the study of a period, style, craftsmanship, method of construction, or use of indigenous materials, and which retains a high degree of integrity. That's the first finding that they had. And then second is that the area contains sufficient historical integrity to convey a sense of historical time and place. And what integrity refers to is that are there modifications to the original or not? Are the buildings original enough that they still convey a sense of the original time and place for the significance of those properties historically? So they did make a preliminary determination, and then, again, under the ordinance, they met on October 3rd, and they held a public hearing. And at that time, the Preservation Commission, at that public hearing, they recognized 8 people, including the applicant, who spoke in favor of the application for designation, and then 2 people spoke in opposition to the application, and then there's a third person who didn't speak either for or against the application, but he had some real concerns about the public hearing process that he wanted to address. The 2 opponents speaking in opposition to the application either owned a property or represented a property owner in the proposed district. And then following the public hearing, the Preservation Commission voted 7-0 to recommend that the Urbana City Council that the application be approved. And prior to that recommendation, they looked at the issue in detail of should the entire, all of the properties in the application be included, all 14 properties, or some be excluded, based on whether or not they still retain historic significance. As part of our ordinance, we have to determine which properties, if enacted in the district, would be considered contributing versus non-contributing. Properties that are non-contributing are either vacant or they've lost their integrity such that there's nothing still conveyed that's historic about the property. Maybe they've been so modified, so changed that it does not convey historic integrity. And again, the Historic Preservation Commission recommended for all 14 properties. In terms of owner preference forms, that's an important provision that we should talk about. We mailed out property owner preference forms to all 14 property owners, and we received property owner preference forms in support of the district from 7 of the 14 property owners, and in opposition, 6 of the 14, and then 1 property owner we didn't receive a form back, although they had called in earlier and said that they were in favor of the district and asked us to pass that word along to the Plan Commission, but they never did formally turn in a form. So at this point, I understand that there's because more than 40% of the property owners have a registered preference against the nomination, then that would, by ordinance, that would require a 2/3 majority in order to enact this district here tonight. So with that, you have 3 options. You could approve the application with reduced boundaries per the ordinance, or deny the application. And in this case, we have 2 different recommendations. One from the Historic Preservation Commission that recommends adopting all 14 properties, that the application, that it does meet the criteria to adopt all 14 properties. The city staff is recommending slightly reduced boundaries to include 12 properties, but not the 2 properties at the far west end on the north and south side of that block, which would be 813 and 816 West Main Street. You have a complete application. You have photographs of the properties. You have in your packet. You have analysis of the historical and architectural significance as well. Thank you.
We have a number of people who would like to speak to the council on this. First, Randy Kangas. Would you please state your name and address and keep your remarks to 5 minutes?
Hi, I'm Randy Kangas, 804 West Main. the Italian 8 and 802, so we own that corner. Suzanne Bissonette and I do. Live there with our children. I'll try and be very brief. You've seen a significant amount on the history of this area. It has significant architecture, so it has all the things you want in a district, both the history and a unique built environment. I think a district needs to stand as a unit. I would urge you to take the entire district as recommended by the commission. I don't think these will stand individually. If you start tipping the balance too far in terms of density, it just simply won't last through time. There's a significant amount of pressure and has been through time. At one point, at least the oral history was the house we're living in was set for demolition, but was saved by the efforts of Marilee McDonald and Bruce Rittner. So I'd urge you to take the entire district and let it stand together rather than parsing out individual pieces. The other thing I would like to say is that I see this really as a good neighbor ordinance. If you're like me, you probably hadn't looked at the ordinance for a long time, and what it really says is if you make a change to the exterior of the house, you need to go through a review process. It doesn't say you can't change landscaping. It doesn't say you can't paint. It doesn't say you can't do normal repairs. You can't fix windows. All those things. You can do all of those things. You can fix outbuildings that are not visible behind the street. You can replace existing mechanical and electrical service equipment. You can do anything you want to the interior of the house. So this is really a good neighbor ordinance or covenant, much like covenants in modern subdivisions. In the modern subdivisions, they even go down to the level of you can't park certain types of cars in your driveway, or you can't have a basketball hoop. This is really not very intrusive. This is a good neighbor policy. If you really want me to be honest, I can't figure out why anyone that is in an older part of town that was pre-existing before covenants came in, why you wouldn't want something like this. I mean, what you're subject to is tear downs right next to you, or somebody that's in a small house that suddenly goes up 3 stories, or something like that. So I don't see this as terribly intrusive. I think this is an important section of Urbana, and I would urge you to take the entire district. Questions?
Mr. Smythe.
Yeah, Randy, I guess staff recommendation is to not include the 2 houses that are basically border Lincoln. So it's not like they're taking pieces of the whole district. It's contiguous, except that they're saying to leave the 2 on the end out of the district. Though in the case of one of the property owners, he's signed on as one of the supporters. So. Which leaves me as, I don't know which way to go here because of that. So, given that it is on the end of the block and the 2 houses there, and they are, much more modern and so on, do you see any, I mean, does it really not meet the spirit of having this contiguous section?
Well, I would say first you go to the kind of the natural boundaries. Second, the Historic Commission discussed that in length. I mean, they debated that back and forth, and in fact had a vote on whether to break them apart, and voted unanimously not to cut out those pieces. And they really did spend a lot of time on that. The person that owns that is interested in being a part of the district. And lastly, again, I think when you start parsing them up almost arbitrarily, that you start creating a problem for the next one, and then the next one, and the next one. So you kind of divide and conquer. Yeah.
Ms. Stevenson?
Do you really think it's a good neighbor policy if you have 50% of the people that don't want to have this district? Do you think it's a good neighbor policy to have it when 50% of the neighbors don't want to have it?
I think only one of those properties that was discussed, I think only one of those is actually a homeowner. All the rest of them are absentee landlords.
Absentee as in they don't
live there.
But they live in, but I believe that they live in.
They do not live in that district.
They live in Champaign County, I know that.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Sure, but they do not live in that district.
Okay. So you think it's a good neighborly thing to tell other people what to do with their property?
Well, I guess what I would say is we have ordinances and zoning restrictions right now, so we already tell people what to do with their property.
When people buy those properties, they are aware of those zonings. And when people buy homes in the newer areas with covenants, they are aware of the covenants. This is being brought on, and I don't believe it is a very good neighborly thing to tell other people what to do with their money when they have already purchased something and they are aware of the zoning, and then you want to go and change things on them. That's not a good neighbor.
Okay, Ms. Chenoweth.
I'm not sure if you're the right person to answer this question, but since it's your neighbors, I figured I'd ask. Why is it that 710 and 708 were not included in this designation, given that they're properties of first importance as indicated by PACA, and they're contiguous with the district that is being proposed? Do you know the history behind that?
That's on the, excuse me, we're talking about the 800 block? That's the
700
block?
Yeah,
And
just the folks right
710
across.
side would be Holy Cross, or I'm sorry, St. Patrick's Church.
Oh, 710 is St. Pat's Church?
Yep.
Oh, okay, I thought it was further down. So it's St. Pat, the 710 and 708 is probably, okay, thanks. I know that they opposed that before.
Any other questions? Thank you. Dan Folk.
I'm Daniel Folk. I live at 807 West Main Street. I also own 814 West Main, and I'm the author of this, along with my neighbors, but my name's on this application. We have some houses on the 800 block that I don't think anyone who's been involved in this discussion is going to deny are historic houses. They're big houses built by prominent families who are wealthy, big budgets. They probably made news at the time. That people probably drove out to the edge of town. I mean, this was sort of the Trails of Brittany of 1880, I suppose, to see these big new houses going up. They made architectural news. They're imposing. I want to talk a little bit about the other houses that I don't think are, because they're less famous and less fancy, I don't think they're less historic. For example, my house at 814, or Mr. Wakeland's house at 809. I mean, these were probably not built by architects. I suppose they were probably built by contractors and craftsmen who executed them according to the fashions of the day. But nobody is going to look at those houses and not understand that they're turn-of-the-century houses. And they are as fully, even though they're simple, they are as fully evocative of 1900 as are the big fancy houses. And I just think it's worth considering when we look at that block to realize that a lot of these contributing properties set the tone for the neighborhood just as well as the two Busey houses and the Sheldon house, and if I modestly may say my house at 807. Now, you hear, there's been a lot of discussion in the public meetings about the boundaries, and I don't doubt you'll discuss the boundaries, and staff has their opinion about the appropriate boundaries. Let me just tell you what I thought when I began to think about this as a real problem in early summer, when it became clear that either I or the not-for-profit that I'm involved with would buy 814. Main Street is unique historically. It's an important thoroughfare. It's older than Urbana. It's older than European settlement of Illinois. It's apparently built on a Native American trail that ran through this country. It's historic in itself. And while we could have turned the corner and looked for some other properties that might have helped our case, I thought it was important to keep it on Main Street. And the block seemed to be the boundary that was the default. We had to kind of think our way through not having the whole block. Extending it west of Lincoln, well, that's fairly obvious. The neighborhood west of Lincoln changes character and is largely going to be part of the university at some point anyway. That seemed a natural boundary. Busey is bounded by the church, which I believe is zone multifamily. Part of it's old, part of it's modern. The south side has a modern apartment building and a modern duplex. That seemed the other appropriate natural boundary. So once I started to work with a block, I realized if we're going to divide this, and I hope you'll think about this, if you're going to draw a line between two of these properties, there's no natural geographic boundary. There's no park or stream or grove of trees or anything. These houses sit next to each other. And you have to draw a boundary that goes right down the middle of someone's driveway or someone's side yard and says this property has to bear the burden of an historic ordinance that requires by fiat that they provide some historic amenities, an ambiance, a historic charm to the neighborhood that the house immediately next door doesn't bear at all. And it gets everything from the other house and gives nothing back. And that's just a hard thing to think about doing. Certainly I thought about the staff, what the staff ultimately has recommended with ignoring or leaving out 816. It is a modern house. But Mr. Reynos is supportive, and he'd like to be a part, and it seemed impossible to me to leave him out when he supports the district and wants to be in the district. And so we had to think through the south side. I mean, my house and 807 and a half are very close. They share a common driveway. 807 and a half is very narrow. It's only 40 feet wide. 809 is only 40 feet wide. These houses are extremely close. And 809 is clearly contributing. 807 and a half is a vacant lot now, but does one really want to have two contributing properties with one in between that doesn't bear any regulatory burden? 809 or 807 and a half, although a house that's been torn down, can still be rebuilt. It just has to be rebuilt using a standard of compatibility, as I understand the ordinance. Modern construction, modern materials, just has to meet some design criteria for compatibility. And so I guess one is left thinking about the two modern structures at 811 and 813. 811 is modern. It's brand new. It might, in the way I would think about compatibility of a modern structure in the ordinance, it might come close to fitting that standard of compatibility for a new house in an historic district. Maybe it's a good transition, but then we wind up with eliminating one property all the way down at the end out of the whole 14, 813, the little apartment building. And to eliminate one property that's modern, that will will stand there for decades without any changes at all. One would expect this ordinance to have no impact on it at all for many, many, many years to come. Keeping the continuity of the block seemed to be more important than just eliminating one property. So by that process, for me, it's just very difficult to carve off any of these, and I would encourage you to keep it as a whole. Just let me say in conclusion, I own two houses in historic districts, and one in Bozeman, Montana, and one in Natchitoches, Louisiana. My kids live in them. They're university towns. Their downtown to campus area has an historic overlay in both cases. New houses get built. We have a new house right across from us in Bozeman. Modern materials, modern windows, siding. It just meets the design compatibility to fit into a nice older neighborhood. And I think based on my experience in those communities whose regulations are word for word like Urbanus, I think this will be just as successful for our neighborhood and will benefit all the properties on the 800 block. So, can I answer any questions?
Any questions? Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay, next, Glenn Stanko.
Good evening. My name is Glenn Stanko. I'm an attorney. I represent Howard Wakeland, Craig Wakeland, and Joyce Wakeland, who own the properties at 807 and a half, 809, 811, and 813 West Main on the south side of the street at the west end of the block. They have objected to the petition. I'll ask your indulgence here. I know you have a 5-minute limit, but this is complicated material, and I'm not sure I can give you a total overview in 5 minutes, so I ask your indulgence if I go over a little bit. There's a process provided in the historic preservation ordinance for these type of things. And unfortunately, I don't think it's worked here. And I will say up front that I believe the Historic Preservation Commission members are all diligent public servants, well-intentioned individuals, and all have a passion for historic preservation. The problem here is that they were thrust in a role that I don't think they've had to perform before, and I don't think they were really prepared for. And that role was to sit, what I would say, in an adjudicatory capacity, to listen to the evidence presented on behalf of the applicant and in opposition to the application, and then to make findings of fact and to submit a report and to summarize the evidence to the City Council. And in fact, the ordinance does say that it is the obligation of the nominator to provide evidence of suitability for historic district status as well as documentation of such evidence. And the ordinance does say it's the obligation of the commission to take testimony presented by the nominator, the owners, and other parties. And it does say that the Preservation Commission's recommendation shall be in writing and shall be accompanied by a report summarizing the evidence presented at the hearing and a report to the Commission's findings. My concern is that, number one, if you look at the report submitted by the chair of the Commission, there's no discussion at all of the evidence that we presented. And we presented a pretty fair amount of evidence. We talked a lot about whether or not many of these properties were really contributing properties, particularly the ones on the north side to the west of 806 and 809 on the south side. And we had a color chart that we gave to the Plan Commission, and we coordinated that with the PACA survey in 1985. And it's our contention that properties that fell in Category 3 on the PACA survey, areas of third importance, are really non-contributing properties under the Historic Preservation Ordinance because they have no architectural or historical significance in and of themselves. They're really properties designed to be transitioned between properties of historic significance. So we talked a lot about that. We talked about the lack of integrity of Mr. Wakeland's house at 809. We talked about the fact that Urbana already has a two-house historic district. So that, I think, mitigates against the idea that you have to include a whole block. We talked about the fact that in 1989, in a case where Mr. Wakeland challenged the downtown to campus plan and the downzoning in that plan, that Mr. Folk had testified in court that Mr. Wakeland's properties, specifically 809, which is the only house left standing, had no historic value. So in that case, 8 years ago, he testified that they had no historic value, and now in his petition, he claims that they do have historic value. And what he did is lump a number of properties outside of the ones at 804, 806, 803, and 807, which nobody contests have some historic value. He lumped those and just said that they have significant heritage value. But in the end, I think the Commission was clearly uncomfortable with its role as being a finder of fact. One of the commissioners remarked afterwards, when they discussed this after we left, that he was not comfortable serving in the role of a juror because I had likened their role to that of a jury. And the chair jumped all over me when I talked about people giving testimony, and she said it wasn't testimony, but the evidence itself, or the ordinance itself, calls it testimony. Unfortunately, laid on all of this, we asked for a right to ask Mr. Folk questions, in essence, a right of cross-examination. And we did this based on a 2002 Illinois Supreme Court case, which said that in special use permit cases, the objectors have a right to due process, and that due process is the right to cross-examine the person who is seeking the special use permit. And in fact, the Illinois legislature codified that ruling after that case was decided and basically said that in zoning hearings, due process has to be provided. So because we were concerned about things that were and were not in Mr. Folk's application, we requested the right to ask him questions, i.e. cross-examine him. That apparently got out and about because we had people running in here commenting at the beginning of the hearing how terrible it was that people could be cross-examined when they came in and spoke in favor of something. Now, we weren't cross-examining other people who came in and spoke in favor of the district. We only asked for the right to ask Mr. Folk questions, and in fact, I didn't conduct it. If you watch the video of it, I didn't conduct it like an examination as I would do in court. I asked him questions. I don't think Mr. Folk was intimidated, but the commission was obviously very put off by that fact. And again, there's an interesting 6-minute segment if you watch the video of that meeting, which I did last night, where the chairman used terms like being extremely disturbed by the fact that we asked him questions, that it was an absolute debacle, that we'd made a mockery out of the proceedings, that they didn't like our line of questioning, how the line of questioning was derogatory and intimidating, how they didn't think Mr. Wakeland should be able to have a lawyer in here and ask someone who wasn't represented questions, how we'd ask irrelevant questions. And mind you, they felt it was irrelevant that I wanted to ask Mr. Folk about the fact that he testified 8 years ago that these houses had no historic value. So unfortunately, all of that, I think, colored what transpired in front of the Historic Preservation Commission. And I assume most of you own property, your home, maybe rental property, and if one of your neighbors filed something, you got a notice in the mail that said something had been filed asking to impose more restrictions on your home than it had when you bought it. I mean, you buy it, as Ms. Stevenson made the point, knowing the zoning, knowing the covenants. You don't know somebody's going to come along and try to impose greater restrictions. I think you would be concerned about that if you were in that situation, and you might want to ask the person who filed the application a few questions. And in this case, certainly Mr. Wakeland and Mrs. Wakeland and Craig Wakeland were all more directly affected than people were in the special use permit case. In that case, they were only indirectly affected because the neighbor was trying to do something to his property. Here, it's their properties that are being affected. In the end, my point is, again, I think the commission was uncomfortable with what it was doing. I don't believe it communicated to you what the evidence was that we presented. I do see that one of my early letters got included in your packet. I don't know if you had a chance to read it. But the whole thing pretty much got hijacked by people coming in and saying what a horrible thing it was that we were conducting some cross-examination. In fact, one gentleman had been watching it on cable TV and came in during during our case saying that he just thought this was a terrible precedent. In the end, there's 4 properties at the east end of the block that arguably have some historic value. The justification for including the rest, as I understand what Mr. Folk said at the Historic Preservation Commission hearing, and he said it again tonight, is they reflect the period in which they were built. Well, what house doesn't reflect the period in which it was built? If that could always be the justification for including something in an historic district, then everything would be in a historic district. But that's essentially the justification. Again, beyond those properties, most of the properties to the west, except the ones that have been conceitedly labeled as non-contributing, we think have wrongly been labeled contributing because in and of themselves they weren't found to have historic value. So that has just kind of been accepted at face value all the way along, and nobody's asked any hard questions about that from the city standpoint, but that's the way it's turned out.
You've taken 10 minutes. Would you like to try to
I'm about 2 sentences
summarize
away.
your...
Yes, I will. Thank you, Madam Mayor. In the end, I think we would like you to consider a couple of things. Number one, if you think a historic district is appropriate, make it a 4-house historic district. You already have a 2-house one. And knock off everything west of 806 and 807, or if you just want to deal with the south side of the block, because there are 1 or 2 on the north side where people have consented, then knock off everything west of 807 on the south side of the block. Or number 2, just vote against this ordinance, because it's not a situation where all of these houses belong in a historic district. Thank you for being accommodating. I'm sorry for running over. I'd be happy to answer questions.
Ms. Chenoweth.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question. What does your client want to do that he can't or won't be able to do if these properties are designated historic?
Well, number one, probably the house at 809 would ultimately be demolished and a new house built there, and that will certainly impact the ability to do something with that house. That was one of the motivations for Mr. Folk filing the petition. Number 2, he wants to build a house at 807 and a half. He has plans to do another nice house like he did at 811, and he wants to do it in the way he sees fit and not in the way that somebody dictates to him.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Carolyn Baxley.
Carolyn Baxley, 510 West Main Street. There are a lot of issues before you. I think the number one thing that you need to think about is the purpose of a historic ordinance, historic preservation ordinance in the first place. The city saw fit to direct a committee to draft the ordinance. The council adopted it. It provides for the designation of districts, landmarks, et cetera. And you've been talking for the last couple of months about your interest in historic preservation. This district has come forward in good faith. Mr. Folk has brought it forward. As you well know, we tried to get enough of the people on Main Street to do the entire street a few years ago. We fell 0.5% short of the needed people that we needed. Now the whole street has changed, and trust me when I say that we will be bringing other areas of Main Street back to you. But to get back to the ordinance, I mean, if you want districts, you have to think of a district in terms of a whole. You can't piecemeal it. You can't put a historic house next to a property that's not designated, because there's zero control over what goes in on that property next to you. It could destroy the whole appearance of the district. The point of including all the properties on the 800 block is that, let's say, God forbid, there's a fire and one of those nonconformities burns down. If that should happen, the hope would be that you would have a compatible property then put up, which would be in conformity with the district. So you do districts, not piecemeal. You wouldn't want to do this piecemeal any more than you would want to do spot zoning. Spot zoning is a bad idea. Any planner will tell you that, and that's, I think, what would be happening here if you start chopping away. You should uphold what your Historic Preservation Commission has recommended. Keep in mind their vote was 7-0, and hopefully that would be enough to convince you to do it. Just a couple of other points. One about the process. There's been a lot of discussion about the process that took place before Historic Preservation Commission. And in his defense, I want to tell you that Dan Folk had no notice of being cross-examined. He was in his fields cutting soybeans at 5:30 and was told that he was going to be questioned by Mr. Stanko. That's the kind of process that the neighbors were very much opposed to and that we thought was not in keeping with the public spirit of coming before any commission or city council and giving testimony. It discourages people from doing it. You want people to come forward and express their views, and when that kind of thing happens, it takes the whole thing into a different arena, and that's what we were protesting, my husband in particular, at the last meeting. So, as I said, I hope you'll take it as it comes to you from the commission. Consider that hopefully at some point we will extend the district down Main Street. This was one of the most significant roads in our history, the Fort Clark Road, and at some point I personally would love to see some grant money coming our way to restore the look of that stretch down Main Street, and maybe come up with some of the some of the funds that we need to do some of the historic signage and things that you talked about at a previous meeting. So this is the beginning of it, and hopefully we can take it forward from there. So keep that in mind as you consider this, and think of it as a neighborhood. The residents in this area want this almost exclusively, and the opponents are almost exclusively people who live elsewhere. So just keep that in mind, and thanks for your time.
Any questions for Carolyn Batson? Thank you very much. Brian Adams?
My name is Brian Adams. I live at 412 West Elm Street in Urbana. I wish to express my support for the proposed historic district in the 800 block of West Main Street. I support the proposed district in the form recommended by the Historic Preservation Commission at its recent meeting, with boundaries extending from Lincoln Avenue to Busey Avenue and including all the non-contributing properties at 807.5, 811, 813, and 816 West Main. I support the inclusion of all properties nominated in the proposed historic district, as Urbana's Historic Preservation Ordinance, Section 12-2, allows for the inclusion of non-contributing properties, as such properties, quote, are important to the preservation of the district, end quote. I'm concerned that if the non-contributing properties are excluded, future development on these lots could be incompatible with other existing structures in the proposed district. I also support the district boundaries as recently recommended by the Preservation Commission, as these boundaries are clear and non-arbitrary. By excluding various lots, the unique historic and architectural cohesiveness of the block will be destroyed. Two of the properties recommended for exclusion from the district, 813 and 816, are located near the intersection of West Main Street and Lincoln Avenue, an important historic, you might call it a gateway into downtown Urbana, coming in from the west to the east. I think it's important to ensure that this important aspect of the proposed district maintains its historic setting. Further, this section of West Main Street represents a segment of the historic Fort Clark Road that connected the Danville area with the Illinois River via the sort of Champaign through the Urbana area. I think it's important to maintain the historic integrity of this historically unique section of West Main Street. And then briefly, Mr. Kangas touched on this a little bit earlier, but I took a look at there's a table in the ordinance, the preservation ordinance, which lists projects that would require review by the Preservation Commission for non-contributing structures. And there's a list of 31 projects, and out of that list, there's really only 4 types of projects that would require any type of review by the Preservation Commission. So I don't really think that contributing structures that would be within this district are really going to be under a lot of experiencing a lot of problems in terms of meeting the requirements if they want to do some sort of upgradings or repairs or whatever on their properties. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Adams? Okay. Phyllis Winters Williams.
I'm Phyllis Winters-Williams. My husband Joe and I live at 810 West Main in Urbana. We're the cute arts and crafts with a big green roof and a lot of mums out front. I'm house proud, and I'm proud of it. And I promise to be nice and be short. And I want you to pass this. Let us become a historic district, finally. I always thought that this ordinance was written for us. You need to include Fernando and the house at the end. We need to go from 816 to 802. And we need to include the little apartment building at the end, at 813. You know, as far as apartments go, it's really kind of an old-fashioned, beautiful little thing. It's a shame that the parking is right there on the street. That's the way it is. When you turn the corner off Lincoln, though, and you come down Main, you see the vista. And remember, Lincoln used to look like that, too, before we widened it. It was all a canopy of trees. These are the same trees that the Buseys looked at. It's the same trees that the Sheldons looked at. God knows there's a Norway spruce. One of them may have brought back from a vacation and planted. It's, we went to the archives, and I gave Randy and Suzanne last night the bill of the inheritance tax bill for Matthew Busey. Sheep, cows, we had it all. We had outbuildings. I'm probably sitting on top where the bulls were because my flowers grow so big. I realize it's about property and not personality, but it's hard to separate the two because this is such a big piece of your life for any of us. But we need to be all there. And I really think of Fernando's house at the end as a bracket, just as the old Darrow house, which is 802. These beautiful little houses that were put there as a patriotic statement because we were in such a housing crunch. Remember, we had veterans living in basically little shacks out on Stadium Terrace. And so there was a desperate need for housing. And the Main Street neighborhood filled that bill with these quickly put up houses that, in spite of being put up in about a day, according to Michael Walker, have stood the test of time. Please, pass this the way the Historic Commission has brought it to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Anyone have a question? All right. Next, Carl Long.
Carl Long, 812 West Main Street. I am the other opposition represented here tonight. I sit here and I watch these hearings, this being the third one for this, and I continue to hear statements based on feelings and statements based on what we want to see happen, but I don't hear enough statements based on fact and based on what really is the precedence for having a historic district. The only person that's really brought fact to this so far has been Mr. Wakeland's lawyer, and that's really what we need to sit down and listen to tonight, and that is the actual fact and the reasoning as to why this does not qualify as a historic district. If we set a precedence of this neighborhood being historic, a neighborhood including an apartment complex, an empty lot, a 2-year-old house, 2 houses built in the 1950s, then we start to, to really throw caution to the wind as to how strong our rulings are based on fact anymore. We can't let our feelings and our wants and desires affect whether or not this gets passed or whether or not we feel this is a historic neighborhood. We need to look at the absolute fact, and we need to pick neighborhoods that 100% qualify to be historic. I think there's some beautiful, amazing houses on that block, and I enjoy looking at them as much as anybody else, but there's also rental property on that block. There's campus access down Lincoln. It's a nearby campus neighborhood now. It's no longer a historic pathway for anyone. It's had some amazing times, and it's still a beautiful neighborhood to be seen, but it's no longer a full 100% historic neighborhood. It's been changed, and we can no longer go back to what it was. We need to continue to move forward, and we need to understand that new buildings will be built on that street. If you want to maintain and keep properties in your name, pass it on to your children, and continue to have your older, beautiful properties, that's fine. But other people have come into that neighborhood now. We've made our purchases, we've made our decisions, and we will continue to build and grow as opposed to being stopped by ordinances that really have no merit on this block at this time. That's all I have to say.
Any questions?
Dennis? Sorry.
Do you live at 812
No, I do
West
not.
Main? So you don't live at the home? You're not?
I don't live at the home.
It's not owner-occupied?
It's a duplex. It's
duplex.
rented to students, and I live about a block and a half away. I visit the property multiple times a week.
Do you think that a duplex is not eligible to become a historic property?
I really don't believe it is. I understand that the property is an older property, but it's been modified. I don't believe it represents a true historic property any longer. It's got 2 doors on the front. It's got what used to be another room, possibly apartment in the basement. It doesn't still have significance. There's a stairway that used to go from the inside to the upstairs that's no longer even exists. It's blocked off. The entrances have been modified. The property's been modified. It doesn't properly represent what it was at one time.
But, let's see, is the house over 50 years old?
Yes, sir, it is.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Anybody else?
Ms. Chenoweth.
Yes, I just wanted to ask you if your property is designated historic, is there something that you would like to do to it that you won't be able to do because of that designation?
You know, that I don't know yet. I'm still reading through and trying to understand, and I understand as was presented tonight, maybe it isn't as restrictive as it looks in the paperwork, but I guess that will be seen down the road. I don't know what could happen to that property in the next 5 or 10 years, but I don't want to be forced to have to build to somebody else's standards. I want to be able to put my own uniqueness on the neighborhood someday. I don't want to have to follow the trail of 1900 style building. I want to follow the trail of future building. I want to build something similar to what Wakeland has put across the street from me, which I think is a gorgeous new style building that will comfortably accommodate tenants for years to come.
So it's your hope to build a new structure at that location? You
Not-
said it was 812 that you own?
812 West Main Street. Not immediately. I love it for what it is, but it is an older property, and unfortunately, I don't know if I can properly maintain it to the level of historical significance that it currently has. I want to be able to do maintenance upgrades and repairs to the best of my and my contractor's ability without having restrictions stop us from using the materials that we deem fit.
Okay, thank you.
No, thank you.
So what is your address?
I'm sorry. I live at 105 North Kohler currently.
Okay. Oh, Mr. Roberts.
It appears that the house in question, 812, already has been sided with modern siding. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Not by me, but when I purchased it, it had already been sided with modern siding. That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you, counsel.
Okay, thank you. Naomi Jacobson.
Thank you very much. I'm Naomi Jacobson. I live at 803 West Main Street in Urbana, and I've lived in not just the neighborhood for over 36 years, but in 803 West Main Street. And it is a fact that I have seen improvements to homes in the time that I've lived there, and I think it's because of, one person making an improvement and another person seeing the value of these historic homes and seeing the improvements. Unfortunately, we've seen some neglect, but fortunately, the improvements and the restorations have been a better influence, and we would like to see the preservation of this block and this neighborhood. And I realize I'm saying we. My husband Eric is the one who signed the petition. He isn't able to be here this evening. He's traveling, and I also realized that the owner preference form wasn't returned, and because he signed the petition, everything is addressed to him. And I probably didn't look at his mail closely enough to put it aside and put it right on top and say, you need to look at this. So it's not that there was some reason for not signing that form and returning it. I did speak with him earlier this evening, and he said, oh, yes, please do speak on my behalf. We do support the ordinance as proposed, including the entire block. I would like to see it stand as a unit. And we are one of those houses that has a lot of oral history. We're the second owners of a house that's over 100 years old. And so, we've known the people who've grown up in it. We knew the son of a former mayor of Urbana, and I guess he was a grandson of someone else who was a legislator and a mayor. And so there are historic figures who had lived in that house also. And again, I would just like to close with, please vote for this ordinance.
Any questions? Thank you very much. Is there anyone else who'd like to address the council on this issue? Okay, we have the ordinance. Is there a motion? Oh. Beg your pardon? Did you want to say something, Robert?
I probably should clarify one point that was made during the public participation portion, and that's a question about the evidence that's presented to you here tonight. According to the ordinance, the Historic Preservation Commission has to make a written report, which they've provided, and as part of that report, the minutes are important in that they're a detailed record of the evidence that was presented. And so in your packet, there are minutes from both of those meetings, including the October meeting. And I see also in the packet, there's copies of all of the written correspondence provided by Mr. Stanko on behalf of his client, the Wakelands. And I also see that the color, well, the PACA survey that was prepared, there's a copy in your staff report here as well, and I see before you a color copy that's also that you have. So we do feel like that there's a sufficient record.
Thank you. Ms. Chenoweth.
I just have a couple of additional questions for staff. The first is, can you give us a sense of what the process looks like if in a district properties that are less historic or new or considered not contributing properties like a new house, how they would be handled when changes to the exterior would be made? Are they treated any differently? You know, I know that the prior council talked about this issue of handling non-contributing properties differently. I'm pretty sure we haven't changed our ordinance since that discussion, so the ordinance remains the same. So could you provide us a sketch of what that process would look like for some of the properties, like a new apartment building or a new house or a vacant lot?
Sure. One of the reasons it's so important to recognize which properties are contributing and non-contributing if a district is enacted is that way that provides the basis for a different process depending on what type of property it is. So if it's a contributing property, there's one set of guidelines that it has. If it's a non-contributing property, there's a lesser standard. There's a lesser set of guidelines. So a non-contributing property, for instance, in our ordinance, it actually lists out all of the different actions that someone might want to do on their property, and then it provides what is the process for that. Some things don't, if it's not contributing property, some things don't require any review at all. Other things require a staff review, and there's a few things that require a Historic Preservation Commission review, and one of those things is new construction. Now, if you build a new building on a vacant lot in a historic district, there are standards for that. It's not historic standards. You don't want to necessarily build a new house that has to look old or mimic some historic style necessarily. If the property owner chooses to do that, that's one thing. But actually, a lot of historic preservation standards actually discourages that. So what our guidelines, design guidelines really are for new construction for non-contributing properties is basically that the building respects the very basic building form questions, the setback, the height, the entryway fronts the street. The buildings, for instance, are vertically oriented rather than, in other words, they're taller than they are wide. There's some preferably parking is to the side or to the rear. those are the sorts of things. But you don't get into questions about, you know, what type of gingerbread does it have or anything like that. That's.
Just follow up question. Thanks, that's helpful, because I was concerned the new construction meant you had to make it look like the old, and I don't think that really allows for innovation, but, so I appreciate that. The second question I have is, I know 808, which is a beautiful house in many ways, is also probably one of the, just from an exterior point of view, one of the most poorly maintained properties on Main Street, unfortunately. Do we know of code violations at that location? What's kind of the status in community development of that property, and is it, you know, what's its code status, I guess is the question.
Yeah, Libby Tyler has some specific information about that she can share.
No, I put it in this file. The Barracks House, we're working on some code violations. You can pretty much see it if you drive by. There's a problem on the porch, and we've barricaded that. We have sent a notice of violation August 17th, and then September 10th, a follow-up on that. There's some good news in that we have an opportunity for an emergency grant to assist with the repairs and some volunteer labor from Empty Tomb to hopefully get the repairs done. The question is, depending on what occurs this evening, is whether a certificate of appropriateness would be necessary. And so I've been conferring with the Historic Preservation Commission Chair, and I think we would need a determination as to the extent of the life safety threat at this property. It does seem, I know this has been a big concern to the neighbors, and it's something that's been a concern for a long time. The stars are kind of aligned in terms of getting the help to get the repairs done, and the plan would be to replace it the way it was. But again, depending on what happens this evening, we will see if we'll proceed under the prior violation notices and the life safety provisions of the Historic Preservation Ordinance, or whether we'll have to take the time to go through the certificate. Don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
There's progress being made.
Okay, two follow-up questions. One is it an owner-occupied house or a rental?
It's owner-occupied.
Okay. So there's current occupants in that at that location?
Yes, and so we've kind of barricaded off the porch and trying to restrict access at this point to keep anyone from being harmed. We moved had them move the mail box, and we've been working cooperatively with the owners, and like with many of these situations, there's some resource and other issues that we're dealing with.
Okay, thank you. I just have one final question. The final question is, if 816 Mr. Reyna's property is designated historic, is there some way in which is it possible that we could use the right-of-way, city-owned portion of that property to help mark on the Lincoln Avenue side that you're entering a historic district? Is that in the realm of possibility that property in some ways could help be a gateway? Of course, we'd be using the city right-of-way to do that marker, but I guess I wonder if there had been discussion about that or if it's possible.
Well, it makes some sense to provide markers so that people know when they're entering a district, and so that there's not only that the public recognizes, but also so there's self-recognition, and that helps in a number of ways, not just tourism and et cetera, but also in terms of enforcement. If it's in the right-of-way, we need to get, of course, permission from through the Public Works Department, but as long as it's not blocking it's not within the site distance triangle, I think that it would be possible, and we could work that out with Public Works Department.
Okay, great.
Dennis Roberts.
I guess I just wanted to, comment on some of the houses that are not as stately and are considered less, not as contributing to the district's historic nature. Yet, of course, the buildings are, of a certain, like over 50 years old. And the smaller houses, which are had been built, and they're more like the cottages among the grander historic structures that everybody recognizes, are very reminiscent to me of practically all of the East Urbana neighborhoods, which are historic in nature and go back to the days of the early railroad construction in our town, and are probably the unsung neighborhoods in the Urbana area. And the Historic Preservation Commission would call this vernacular style of home construction. And the fact that we have some smaller, less imposing buildings, but which still merit some consideration because of their general simple vernacular style, although modest in size, and less noteworthy perhaps automatically to the eye, still do have veracity in establishing the continuous nature of a district. And if we were to say that we should lop off certain houses because of their size compared to the ones next to them, we would have a checkerboard historic preservation policy, which would not be very useful for establishing a district that is actually follows a very ancient historic trail through the county and through the city of Urbana. I was just reading recently that the reason why Main Street bends here and there's two places that I read, particularly where there's an unexplained bend. Today they're unexplained, but apparently in the early days, the travelers on these paths were making the very logical conclusion of avoiding a buffalo wallow, which during the spring would fill with water and become swampy. And so just because we don't see where the buffalo wallowed today in the year 2007, and we can't figure out why the heck the street bends where it does, doesn't mean that there wasn't a reason, and actually it makes sense if you understand the underlying history. So I guess I'm in favor of including the smaller houses in the district. And when you have a home that is a new house, like 811 West Main Street, which is totally new construction, but which does provide some architectural details that mimic the houses next to it on the street, including front-facing windows, hexagonal dormer window, and gables and pediments or whatever that face the front. I think that we all agree that we do have experiences throughout our town of infill construction, and what we're trying to encourage is compatible infill construction. If this is a historic district, it doesn't require us not to build a brand new building with brand new materials, but that when it's constructed, there have to be certain considerations so that it matches basically a certain appearance or style that might at least be compatible. And I think these are understandable conditions for any house construction. I think you would want your house to be, any home or apartment to be somewhat beautiful in appearance, or at least not the one house that stands out on the entire block as, why did they put that there? So of all the houses that are listed in the historic district, probably the only one that really comes under question is 813, which is a modern apartment house on the corner. It's probably the least compatible on the block. But, and I think I had some concerns about that. It's a brand-new building. It doesn't really match the rest of the historic district feeling. So I didn't know what to think about it until I heard the testimony tonight. And that is that this ordinance would basically have almost basically no impact on that structure. And the reason is because it's a brand new structure. It will have, it's unlikely it's going to have significant repairs in the next couple of decades, assuming that the building is built in materials that are, worthy of, lasting a couple of years, weather, rain, and wear and tear. So what would be the financial burden to the property owner of that structure? He could paint the building a different color. He could add shutters or some details that actually might make it blend in with the neighborhood more appropriately. But otherwise, really, since the historic preservation of the historic district only affects the exterior of a building and not the interior at all, it's really hard to imagine what burden there would be required of the property owner of this brand new apartment house. So I don't know. I guess that was like the one question that I had a problem with coming into this discussion, and I think I heard the answer that the impact would be zero. So if that's true, for the continuity of the entire block, it would make sense to include it. And I don't know. That's just what I've come to think about tonight. Is yes, it's not a perfect block, but what block in this town is? So we have to start somewhere. I'm supportive, I think.
Is there a motion?
Yeah, I'll make a motion.
Motion by Mr. Roberts. Is there a second?
To approve, basically, is my motion, as stands.
Second by Mr. Smythe.
Good question.
Ms. Chenoweth.
I have a clarifying question, because we have so many pieces of paper in front of me. I want to make really clear what is considered the non-contributing properties of this block. I believe, according to the Historic Preservation Commission minutes, that it's 807.5, 811, 813, and 816. And I want to verify with staff that those, they were basically talking about every other property being contributing and those four being non-contributing. Is that correct?
One second. I want to verify one thing.
It's, and also my question is, it's not in the ordinance, the contributing and non-contributing. Is that a problem? Is it an issue? I know it's in the testimony in the Historic Preservation Commission minutes.
Well, the findings of the Landmark Commission, we need to identify which ones would be contributing and non-contributing. And I'm sorry, I'm looking for the page here of the staff report. Actually, I'm sorry. The findings of the Historic Preservation Commission do say which ones are historic and are contributing and non-contributing. And as I've just got some help here. Thanks. If you look at, the memo from Alice Novak to the mayor dated October 11th, this provides the findings of the Historic Preservation Commission, including which properties are contributing and non-contributing. And they've identified the non-contributing addresses 807.5, 811, 813, and 816.
Thanks. I just need a clarification. Appreciate that.
Okay.
Brandon Bowersox.
Yeah, I would just also clarify that even though the staff recommendation was that 813 and 816 could be excluded, the Plan Commission recommendation is the form of the ordinance that the mover and the seconder intended, I assume, and that is the version of the ordinance that is actually in ordinance form for us here on paper.
Any further discussion? Mr. Roberts.
Yeah, and since the property owner at 816 actually wanted to be in the district, even though he's got a ranch house, why not let him be in it?
Charlie Smythe.
Well, I think actually Mr. Long captured how I feel in a very significant way. I think the problem is that for many, many years, our community has suffered from demolition through neglect. And rather than save a number of historic properties 30 years ago when we should have, they've been allowed to decline. And there is no place in town where you can find a perfectly contiguous 3 blocks of historic homes, like you can in many other fine communities. A number of other college communities have dealt with the same thing, and they've dealt with it in a much faster fashion than we have. Bloomington, Indiana, Bozeman, Montana, other towns like that. And where this has been done, it's contributed greatly to the success of the community. And so I look forward, and I'm really disappointed that this isn't 3 or 4 blocks long, like it should be. And but this is a start, and we need to start here. Thank you.
Daniel Chenoweth.
Yeah, I want to speak in support of the motion. I think that lots of the things we've discussed in terms of design standards and kind of design overlay apply here. So a district, I think, is a little bit different in concept than a single designation like the Ricker House, where there's clear, everything about the house is clearly historic. I think in a district, what we provide, especially because we have this contributing and non-contributing distinction, is a kind of design overlay, which doesn't mean everything's going to stay the same, but it does in some ways preserve the character of a space. And I agree with Charlie that I think that much of Main Street is eligible for this kind of overlay. And I hope that this is kind of the beginning of an extension and that we can marker it appropriately. I don't think that first of all, I think that the demolition by neglect that has happened in my ward, of which this is a portion of, is in many ways kind of shameful, and that folks should be required to keep their properties up to code. I also think that what we've seen with historic designation with the Royer District, which was owned by the vet fraternity at the time, I remember with the last council, they came to us and they were so concerned when we designated this district, I think it's on Busey, as historic, because they said, we're going to have problems selling the property, there are all these restrictions, et cetera. We designated it historic, which I think was appropriate. The property values rose. They had absolutely no problem selling the properties. It was actually a boon to those property owners to designate it historic. I think that in some ways, by designating this area historic, which it clearly, to people who have lived here, embodies the character of historic Urbana, kind of raises all boats in this whole area and will actually have beneficial consequences for all the property owners in this area. I certainly think that there's some misperceptions in terms of historic preservation and this kind of boogeyman, and I think that we've been working with staff closely to overcome perceptions that there are a huge number of restrictions applied to folks who have their properties designated historic. I think that's not the case. We certainly want to see development happen in this area. We simply want to see development happen that's within the character of this area. So I support this motion, and I'm happy to move forward.
Brandon Bowersox.
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly speak in favor as well. I think I agree with Dennis and things other people have said, but really, if there's any place in Urbana that is right for a historic district that's large like this, it's West Main Street. And I do agree that I hope other blocks of West Main Street can be included too. It's not just 1 or 2 individual properties. It's that when you go down this street, there's just, every time you look, there's another beautiful home that's hidden in these trees. There's a tree canopy and a continuity to it, and it's really the effect of all of that together that creates the historic value and the character that we're trying to preserve. So I encourage others to vote in support, and I'm really glad that this has come to us.
Anyone else? Okay, would the clerk please call the roll? We're talking about ordinance number 2007-10-119. Motion by Mr. Roberts, seconded by Mr. Smythe.
Mr. Bowersox?
Yes.
Ms. Shenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Lewis?
No.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Smythe?
Yes.
Ms. Stevenson?
Emphatically no.
Okay, so we needed 5 votes on this one? So, do we need 5 out of the 7 or out of
5
those?
votes.
Okay.
5 votes because it says out of all council members holding office.
Okay, so we have 4 votes, so the motion fails. Okay, we have an appointment, a mayoral appointment. Fire Division Chief, Brian Neitlinger, who has been patiently waiting, and actually got appointed as acting Division Chief a couple of weeks ago, I think. And he was recommended by Chief Mike Dilley. Okay, motion by Ms. Stevenson. And what was the second? Ma'am, did you have a question?
Yes, you voted on other stuff and then you didn't vote on this?
We took a roll call vote on it. It required 5 votes. It got 4 votes. So,
That's your question.
was your question whether I vote?
Yes, ma'am.
I don't believe I vote on this. If I do, we'll correct it.
There's some things she votes on and some things she doesn't.
I vote on certain things, but not, mostly I'm the presiding officer, and I don't debate things and I don't vote. Okay, getting back to the appointment, was there a second to the appointment? Charlie Smythe. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Those
Aye.
opposed? Thank you very much. We have a new division chief. Okay. Okay, that gives us 4, I believe. We're up to 4. We're up to full strength now, right?
I guess we are.
Okay, good. Now, the last item that we have is ordinance number 2007-10-120, an ordinance approving a text amendment to the zoning ordinance of the City of Urbana, Illinois, repealing Section 7-11, special use requirements for outdoor advertising signs, amending Article 9, comprehensive sign regulations, and amending Article 10, nonconformities. Do we need an explanation on this one at this point? Because the hour is late. Does someone have a motion?
No, I move to send this to committee 1 week from now.
Second.
Okay, motion by Mr. Smythe, seconded by Mr. Lewis to send this ordinance to committee. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Okay, we'll send it to committee next week. I think Glenn Stanko wanted to talk about it. Did you want to talk about it now? Sorry, I got a little ahead of... No, we're going to have more discussion of it, but did you want to say anything about it?
I'll be brief.
Okay.
Promise I won't go over my 5 minutes. You know what our position is on this, and generally we support the ordinance. First of all, I represent Adams Outdoor Advertising, but you know what our position is on this. Generally, we support the ordinance before you with the changes suggested by staff relating to the distance restrictions, same side of the street, and relating to the change about the TIF district exclusion. That leaves the 2 major things of spacing and Route 130, and I just wanted to bring one thing to your attention about spacing. At 1,500-foot spacing, the city tells us, according to their maps that they've done, that there are 4 new potential sites available for billboards in the whole city. 3 of those are on North Lincoln, north of I-74. Those, my client does not consider viable because there's virtually no traffic up there. I drove up there today to see if I had missed something about that area, but I don't see that area being viable for billboards in 20 or 30 years, if ever. So that leaves one potential site, and that's on East University where the post office is. The post office doesn't lease space to billboards. And I think there's a distance restriction problem there anyway, so really 1,500-foot spacing gives no new available locations. If you go down to 750-foot spacing, and the city did some interim in between 1,200 and 1,000, 750-foot spacing, they say there are 15 new possible locations. 6 of those are again on North Lincoln north of I-74, so those aren't viable. That leaves 9. 2 of those 9 are on East University Avenue. One of those is the post office location that isn't viable. That gets us down to 8. The other 7 locations are on Lincoln Avenue between Bradley and I-74, 3 on Route 45 north of I-74, and 3 on West University Avenue. Some of those locations appear to have distance restriction problems, and others have TIF district problems if the suggested change to the TIF district exclusion isn't made. So, and in any event, the testimony before the Plan Commission is that out of 8 locations, because of availability and suitability, you're lucky to get 1 site. So in the end, there may be 8 possible locations, which at best would lead to 1 opportunity under 750-foot spacing. Just some information you ought to be aware of. As far as Route 130 is concerned, the testimony for the before the Plan Commission was that there were 2 spots along Route 130 that could meet distance restrictions. One of them was at the Walmart site, and the other was at the Menards site. Neither of those companies will lease space for billboards. So if Route 130 is included right now, it would take years before anything could possibly go up. And that would probably depend on what happens east of Route 130, whether it's annexed and what the zoning is when it's annexed. So 750-foot spacing or Route 130, neither one is going to lead to much right now. At best, it might give a little bit better future opportunity. But I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of those facts.
Okay, thank you very much. Ms. Chenoweth.
Could I call for a motion for recess before we adjourn?
Sure.
I'd like to make a 5-minute recess.
Okay. Does anybody want to ask Mr. Stanko a question before the recess?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Back in session, and there being no further business. Okay, is there further business? Mr. Lewis.
In light of the investment that staff has made in all this material that is before us, it would be not to our advantage as a city not to consider part of what they have achieved thus far. And I would like to reconsider and consider just those buildings that are of historical significance.
You're talking about ordinance number 2007-10, the local historic district?
That's correct.
Okay. So you want a motion to reconsider?
Yes.
Is there a second?
May I make that?
I think it needs to be made by someone who was on the prevailing side. Is that correct?
One of the no's.
I'll second the motion to reconsider, but I won't. I will second a motion to reconsider, but, big but here. Please hear me out. Please hear me out. Please, please, please. I will not support historic preservation of homes of people who don't want their homes or properties that they run nominated.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. to reconsider. Does that just require a roll call vote to reconsider, or just voice vote?
Just a voice vote.
Okay, all those in favor of reconsidering ordinance number 2007-10-119, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
Mayor.
Okay, motion carries. Ms. Chenoweth.
I'd like a motion to defer consideration on ordinance number 2007-10-119, an ordinance approving the designation of a local historic district, 800 block of West Main Street, historic preservation case number HP 2007-D-01 to the next council meeting.
Okay, motion by Ms. Chenoweth to defer this until the next council meeting. It was seconded by Mr. Lewis.
Can I speak to that motion?
Ms. Chenoweth.
I think the reason I make this motion is because I think, we have a democratic process here. We certainly went through that democratic process, which I respect, and we don't have two-thirds majority for the ordinance that was originally placed on the table. The issue then is, because this is such a long and staff-intensive and resource-intensive process to go through the designation process, it's possible to forge some kind of consensus between now and 2 weeks from now that would be some portion, and I don't think that we've had the opportunity to forge that consensus. So that 2 weeks would allow us to see if we could forge some kind of consensus. And this is in the public interest because there's so much resources that have been put towards this that if we simply vote it down completely, we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We have to start from ground zero, from the ground zero and work up from there. So I think it's possible for us to come up with some kind of compromise, and I'd like us to have the opportunity to have 2 weeks to consider that. And I appreciate Heather's remarks and Robert's remarks to that, and I think we need to take those into consideration as we move forward.
Thank you. Dennis Roberts.
I'd have to agree. It may not be possible to pass, well, it was not possible to pass the envisioned district, and yet we do know that there are 7 properties that are interested in creating a historic district area owned by 5 different owners, and it is a significant contribution that they're trying to achieve. They've spent several months before a couple different commissions trying to create this new and very desirable, I think, for the city structure. If there are ways of adjusting the district boundaries that make this a success, I think we ought to have the opportunity to try to accomplish that. And I really do appreciate the fair thinking and open-mindedness of those people who've supported a reconsideration.
Heather Stevenson.
As I told Danielle and I told Robert Lewis, I can't support an ordinance for a district when you have lots of different property owners and you have one person wanting to make a whole street a district based on their feelings. And I can't and I never will support that. And from day one, when we've talked about historic preservation, to today and until forever, until I die, I won't support something that, when brought to the commission, the staff, whatever the case may be, if it is not brought to those bodies that make the final decisions by the property owners, and it's brought by someone else that's wanting to tell other people how to feel about their own property and what they've invested their time and money in. I can't do that. When I buy something, I buy it knowing if it's a home. I buy it knowing if there's a covenant, what the zoning is. And to have one person say, well, why don't we make this whole street a certain district? Well, I don't want someone else telling me what to do with my property, and I, as a elected official, don't want to tell other people
what to do with their money and what they bought in their property, and I will never support that.
Okay, anyone else? There being no further business, this meeting is adjourned. Whoops.
Don't we have to did we take a motion on?
We
take a
didn't vote
the
on that
motion?
one?
Oh, okay.